Contract review is the task lawyers spend the most time on, and the one where Claude adds the most immediate value. A thorough review of a commercial NDA, done manually, reading carefully, noting the issues, drafting the position, takes the better part of a morning for a senior lawyer and a full day for a junior. With Claude, the same review is structured, flagged, and ready for your judgment in under 20 minutes. This episode covers the complete contract review workflow, from upload to client summary. Every prompt in full. What comes back at each step, and what to check before anything goes out under your name. The free PDF, every prompt from this episode, copy-ready, mapped to the 5-step workflow, is in the description. Download it before you start so you can follow along and have the prompts ready to use on your next contract. I'm going to use an NDA throughout because it's the contract type every lawyer touches, regardless of practice area. But the workflow applies to any contract: commercial leases, employment agreements, supply agreements, shareholders agreements. The 5 steps are the same. The specific prompts adjust to the document type. 5 steps. Let's get into it. Before the prompts, the honest context for what Claude is and isn't doing when it reviews a contract. Getting this right is what makes the workflow reliable. Getting it wrong is what causes problems. Claude is genuinely exceptional at reading a long document and extracting everything relevant to a specific issue. It doesn't skim. It doesn't miss the clause buried in Schedule 3. It reads the entire document and processes it as a whole before it produces any output. For a 40-page NDA with defined terms scattered across multiple provisions, that's a significant capability. Claude's context window, 200,000 tokens, means it can hold the entire contract, your prior correspondence, and the client's instructions in a single session without losing the thread. Claude is also strong at identifying what's unusual, what's ambiguous, and what's missing. It knows what a standard NDA typically contains and flags where this one departs from that expectation. It identifies language capable of being read 2 ways. It notices what should be there and isn't, and it can redraft any clause in language that shifts the risk toward your client's position. What Claude cannot do? It has no access to Westlaw, LexisNexis, or any live legal database. It doesn't know what's standard market practice in your jurisdiction right now. It knows what was standard in its trained data, which has a cutoff and may not reflect current practice in your specific industry or territory. It doesn't know what a particular counterparty typically accepts in negotiation. And it cannot apply professional judgment. The decision about whether to accept a risk, how hard to push on a clause, and what advice to give the client is always yours. The right frame is this. Claude does the reading, the extraction, the structuring, and the first pass analysis. You apply the judgment, verify the uncertain points, and make the calls. That division of labor, done correctly, is faster and more thorough than either of you working alone. Step 1. Before you upload the contract, brief the matter. This is the step most lawyers skip, and it's the one that makes the biggest difference to the quality of everything that follows. Claude reads better when it knows who it's reading for, what side you're on, and what you're specifically looking for in this contract. An orientation prompt before you upload the NDA calibrates the review to your client's position from the first pass. Here's the orientation prompt. I'm going to upload an NDA for you to review. I act for disclosing party or receiving party. The context is 1 sentence, what the NDA covers and why we're entering it. My primary concern is specific risk or issue. For example, the scope of the confidentiality obligation, the carve-outs from the definition, or the term and post-termination obligations. Flag anything uncertain with verify. Do not start the review until I upload the document. 3 things in that prompt are doing critical work. The first is telling Claude who you act for. Disclosing party and a receiving party have opposite interests in most NDA provisions. The confidentiality obligation that's broad is good for the disclosing party and bad for the receiving party, and vice versa. Claude needs to know which direction to read from. The second is naming your primary concern. This doesn't limit the review. Claude still runs all 4 passes across the whole document, but it tells Claude where to focus the analysis and what to surface first. If your client's specific concern is the carve-outs, Claude leads with the carve-outs and treats other issues as secondary. The third is the instruction, do not start the review until I upload the document. Without this, Claude sometimes produces a generic NDA summary based on its training data before it's seen your specific document. Always include it. You want Claude reading your client's NDA, not a hypothetical one. Upload the NDA after running the orientation prompt. If you're using a Claude Matter project, the orientation is already in the project instructions and you can skip the prompt. Upload the document and go straight to step 2. Step 2. The 4-pass triage. This is the core of the review, and the whole thing runs in a single prompt. Here it is. Review this NDA in 4 passes. Pass 1. What's in it? Summarize the key provisions, the parties, and what the agreement establishes. Pass 2. What's unusual? Flag any provisions that depart from what you'd expect in a standard NDA of this type. Pass 3. What's ambiguous? Identify language capable of being read more than one way, particularly where that ambiguity could favor the other party. Pass 4. What's missing? Identify any provisions you'd expect in an NDA of this type that are absent from this document. Present each pass under a clear heading. Flag anything uncertain with verify. Let me walk through what each pass produces and why it matters. Pass 1, what's in it, is your orientation pass. Before you look for problems, you need to understand what the document is doing. The Pass 1 output gives you a clear picture of the parties, the defined terms that matter, the structure of the obligations, and the key commercial provisions. It's the foundation everything else builds on. Pass 2, what's unusual, is where the commercial review happens. Claude compares this NDA against what a standard NDA of this type typically contains and flags the departures. Unusually broad confidentiality definition, carve-outs that are narrower than standard, an exclusivity provision that isn't typical in this type of relationship. These are the things that warrant a conversation with the client. Pass 3, what's ambiguous, is the risk pass. This is Claude reading the contract for the argument the other side could make. Language that could be read 2 ways. Define terms that don't quite capture what the parties intended. Provisions where the obligation isn't precisely expressed. These are the clauses that generate disputes, and catching them at the review stage rather than the dispute stage is the entire point. Pass 4, what's missing, is the gap read. This is the most underused pass in manual contract review because it requires you to think about what isn't there. No return of information obligation. No provision for what happens to confidential information in the event of a breach. No dispute resolution clause. These absences are invisible in the document itself. Claude surfaces them explicitly. One important note on the Pass 2 characterizations. When Claude says a clause is standard or unusual, that's based on its training data. Verify any characterization your advice depends on, particularly where it's industry-specific or jurisdiction-specific. We come back to this in Step 5. Step 3, the redraft. Turn the review output into a marked-up position. The 4-pass output tells you what the problems are. The redraft prompt turns the priority problems into proposed fixes, in the language of the contract, ready to go back to the other side. Here's the prompt. Based on your review, identify the 3 clauses most in need of amendment to protect my client's position as party. For each clause, quote the original language, explain the specific risk to my client, and provide a redrafted version that addresses the risk while keeping the commercial intent of the clause intact. Flag with verify anything you're not certain about. The 3 clauses constraint is deliberate. You can ask for more, but in practice, the first negotiation position rarely tackles more than 3 or 4 issues at once. Raising too many points signals a difficult counterparty and dilutes the issues that actually matter to your client. 3 forces Claude to prioritize. The keeping the commercial intent intact instruction is what makes the redrafted clause usable rather than theoretical. A redraft that departs so far from the original that the other side rejects it isn't a useful negotiating position. Claude understands this instruction and produces redrafts that shift the risk without departing entirely from the original structure. What comes back? The original clause quoted, the specific risk to your client explained in plain terms, and a redrafted version for each of the 3 priority issues. Before the marked up draft goes back to the other side, run one more prompt. Read these proposed amendments as the other side's lawyer. What would they push back on and why? What in these amendments goes beyond what you'd reasonably expect a counterparty to accept? That read catches overreaching positions before the negotiation starts, rather than during it. Step 4. The client summary. The step most lawyers either skip or do too quickly. The 4-pass review output and the redraft are structured for a lawyer. Your client needs something different. They need to understand what they're signing, what you're proposing to change, and why it matters to them specifically, and what happens if they sign the agreement without those changes. In language they can actually read and act on. Here's the prompt. Using your review of this NDA, draft a plain English client summary. My client is brief description, for example, a founder of an early-stage technology company, not a lawyer. Cover what this NDA does in 1 paragraph, the 3 issues we're proposing to change, and why they matter to my client, and the risks if they sign the agreement without those changes. No legal jargon without explanation. Write as though explaining to an intelligent non-lawyer who needs to make a decision. The description of the client matters more than most lawyers expect. A founder of an early-stage technology company produces different output from a large corporate procurement team. Claude adjusts the level of explanation, the assumed background knowledge, and the tone based on who you tell it the client is. Be specific. After the summary is drafted, run the client read. Read this summary as my client. What would they not understand? What would they want explained before they could make a decision? Does any of it read as legal jargon? That read catches the lawyer speak that survived the first draft, the defined terms you forgot to explain, the risk description that's accurate but not concrete, the recommendation that doesn't tell the client what they need to do next. The client summary prompt is one of the highest value uses of Claude in legal practice and one of the most underused. A client who understands what they're signing makes better decisions. They also generate fewer follow-up calls asking you to explain what the letter meant. Step 5. Verify before anything goes out. This is the step that sits between a Claude-assisted review and a review you can put your name on. The first check is the verify flags. Every flag in the output is a task. Resolve it against a primary source, the contract itself, your research platform, or the client's instructions, before the review goes anywhere. Not most of them. Every one. If you want Claude to do a second check on its own output, run the uncertainty audit. Review this output systematically. Flag with verify anything that should carry a marker but doesn't. Be more conservative than you were in the original output. That prompt catches the propositions Claude stated confidently but should have flagged. The second check is the characterizations. When Claude calls a clause standard or describes a provision as unusual for this type of agreement, that characterization is based on training data. Training data has a cutoff and doesn't know what's standard in your specific jurisdiction, your specific industry, or for this specific counterparty. If your advice depends on a characterization, this exclusivity clause is broader than market standard. Verify it. Ask a colleague. Check your precedents. Use your knowledge of the market. The third check is your professional judgment. Claude identifies the issues and structures the analysis. The decision about whether the risk is acceptable for this client, in this transaction, at this stage of the negotiation, that's yours. Claude produces the map. You navigate with it. That division of responsibility doesn't change regardless of how good the output is. 5 steps. Orientation brief before the upload. 4-pass triage in a single prompt. Redraft to your client's position with an opposition read before it goes back. Plain English client summary with a client read after. And verification before anything leaves your desk. That's the complete Claude contract review workflow. For an NDA, and with the same 5 steps adapted for any contract type. The free PDF in the description has every prompt from this episode, copy ready, with the 5-step workflow mapped out. Download it, run it on your next contract, and adjust the specifics to your matter. One note on where to go from here. This workflow covers NDAs in depth. Every other major contract type, commercial leases, employment agreements, supply agreements, shareholders agreements, has its own prompt set adapted to the specific risk categories and clause structure of that document type. That complete library is coming to this channel as a dedicated product. Subscribe so you don't miss it when it lands. That's the episode. See you in the next one.